Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second installment of our webinar series on cutting transportation emissions. The subtitle for this event is How Minnesota DOT and SSTI Are Tackling the Challenge. I'm Michael Brennis, a researcher with SSTI, the State Smart Transportation Initiative, and I'll be today's facilitator. A recording of today's webinar will be available shortly on our website, ssti.us. And if you missed the first webinar in the series with California and Colorado, that's also available on our website. If you have questions for our speakers, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. We'll get to as many questions as time permits at the end of the webinar. Our speakers today are Chris McCahill, Managing Director of SSTI, and Nissa Tupper, Principal Transportation and Public Health Planner at Minnesota DOT. For those new to SSTI, we're a network for reform-oriented state DOTs jointly operated by the University of Wisconsin and Smart Growth America. Our endeavors include community of practice meetings for leaders of state DOTs, technical assistance with transportation agencies, and knowledge sharing in the form of webinars, papers, reports, and a newsletter, for which the sign-up is on our website. Today's webinar grew out of a series of workshops and technical assistance projects with a number of states across the US and a desire to share lessons from that work. I'd like to thank our sponsors, the Barr Foundation, the National Resources Defense Council, and the US Climate Alliance. For those interested, one AICP credit is available for this webinar. See the link in the chat for details. And with that, I will hand it over to our first speaker, Chris McCahill. Welcome, Chris.
All right, thanks. So once again, welcome. As Michael mentioned, we're going to be talking about strategies for cutting transportation emissions. Before I get into that, I just wanted to start with setting some context that I'm sure folks are familiar with about the current state of transportation emissions in the US. The graph you're seeing now is transportation emissions by sector over the last couple decades. And as folks probably know, we've seen some great progress in cutting emissions from sectors like power through switching to cleaner energy sources. Transportation, on the other hand, has stayed pretty stagnant over the years. It now makes up more emissions than any other sector, about a third of all emissions. And that's for the first time in a while. And the other thing you'll notice looking at this is that we actually see transportation emissions fluctuate quite a bit more than other sectors, especially in recent years during COVID. And that's mainly due to changing travel behavior among folks, driving less during the pandemic. So, while we're thinking about cutting transportation emissions, obviously, a lot of us are thinking about moving to electric vehicles, especially over the long term, so that 20, 30 years from now, we can really meet ambitious clean energy goals. But in the near term, we've seen that there are some opportunities to make sort of fast and real progress on transportation emissions when we think about the travel behavior piece of that equation. So that leads us to talking about VMT, or vehicle miles traveled, and why track VMT. So this, what you're seeing here is some analysis that we did at SSTI, which you can find on our blog, and looking at where emissions would be if clean energy investments and vehicle electrification go as we hope. That is, we would see about 40% or more of vehicles electric in 2050. We would see much cleaner energy sources being used. And we would also see significant improvements in fuel efficiency of gas-powered cars. And even in those cases, as you can see, if VMT increases by 40% over the next 30 years, which is just based on the current trend we're seeing now, then we might only cut emissions by 25% over that time. But if VMT drops by 20% below current levels, we could see up to a 60% reduction. Now that's if things go well. If they don't, that is, we don't see we see closer to 15% of vehicles being electric, which is in line with some federal forecasts, and we don't see the energy sector get as clean as we hope, then VMT is going to play a much more important role in emissions outcomes. If VMT follows the current trend of about a 40% increase over that period, then we could actually see emissions continue to rise in this worst case scenario. If VMT drops 20%, we still could meet a 40% reduction goal. So all this is just to say that we need to consider all these strategies together. But what we're going to be looking a lot at today is how to tackle this VMT portion of the equation. I'll also add that VMT plays a role in things other than just emissions. Obviously, if VMT increases, we are likely to see more energy use, regardless of what the energy source is, more traffic and crashes, probably higher transportation costs. Versus if we take the steps that would be needed to help lower VMT, then we would likely see increased travel options, more livable communities, and meet some of our transportation equity goals. So just a lot of co-benefits of trying to reach some VMT reduction targets. I'll just start by highlighting some actions that we're seeing across other states, beginning with California. Many folks may know they have a state law, SB 743, that requires DOTs and local agencies to measure VMT as an environmental impact instead of level of service, or LOS. All that is just to say that California is considering vehicle travel as an environmental impact and not just the efficiency of vehicle travel. Through this rule, DOT and other agencies are required to limit or mitigate VMT from new projects. So that is, measure how much a project is likely to increase VMT, and if it does, take steps to offset or mitigate that increase. The other example is Colorado. And Colorado's Transportation Commission recently passed a greenhouse gas planning standard to help meet its statewide goals. This rule requires plans from the Colorado DOT and from MPOs to stay within certain allowed greenhouse gas targets. And I should add that this is a rule that Colorado DOT played a key role in shaping this rule and developing strategies for meeting this goal. And obviously, they're taking a lead in implementing the rule beginning this year. And I'll just add once more, this was featured in our last webinar, which you should be able to see a link to in the chat now. So working through this process with a handful of agencies now, I like to lay out a few steps for getting started. And this is sort of teeing up what you'll be hearing from later in Minnesota through a lot of the work we did with them. Step one, in my view, would be to develop a vision for the future and work back from there. I think it's one thing to have sort of an abstract target of reducing VMT by 10 or 20%. It's another thing to understand what the world looks like 30 years from now if we're successfully meeting that goal. And that puts us in a position to think about the steps that's going to be take to get there, and what steps we might need to take immediately in order to see outcomes play out the way we want over a long period of time. That leads to point two, which is identifying first steps. And like I said, causing a very large change, like lowering travel demand over 30 years, takes a lot of incremental steps along the way. So we need to identify the things to do today to make sure we're meeting those targets later. That couldn't be investment priorities. So how are we picking projects and spending transportation dollars? Design standards, how are we designing our roads and transportation infrastructure? And are those design standards aligned with our goals? Land use regulations, as you'll see a little bit later, this is going to be a really important one in meeting goals like this. And so what kind of zoning regulations and other land use policies can we put in place today to make sure that the future looks like what we expect it to look like? And then from there, we can set targets and track progress and adapt. So that means not only setting a 30-year target of 10 or 20% VMT reduction, but setting incremental targets along the way including very near-term targets, so that we can see at any given point in time, are we on track? Are we seeing the progress we hope to? And if not, how do we need to change course to make sure that we're meeting those targets? So now I'm going to just dive into a little bit of process in how to approach this question based on work that we did do with Minnesota DOT that you'll be hearing about in a bit. The first thing I would suggest doing is understanding where VMT is coming from. So a lot of us have counts of VMT every year for statewide or by region. And those typically represent, those are based on traffic counts. So they represent the number of cars on the road, multiplied times the distance they're driving and aggregated up. So that gives us a sense of how much travel is happening, but it doesn't give us a sense of where that travel is coming from and what kind of policies will then help us meet goals that we're talking about. So what you're seeing here is just a map of southern Minnesota with total VMT by census tract. And the first thing that jumps out is when you look at the Minneapolis-St. Paul region, a lot of these census tracts, these neighborhoods here in yellow, are actually producing pretty low total VMT numbers. So that's, even though there's a lot of folks living there, those folks tend not to drive as much. So that's not really some of your larger source of VMT across the state. What does jump out is some of these purple areas that are in some of the more outlying areas where you've got clusters of population where people tend to drive much more because they're much farther from their destinations. As you'll see in a minute, this is really important for thinking about what kinds of strategies it's going to take to meet ambitious climate goals. And just outlining here a couple data sources that you can rely on if you want to go down this route. In this case, we used something called the Latch data set. This is a product that's derived from the National Household Travel Survey. It's based on the travel survey. They've modeled average household VMT at the census tract level for every census tract in the US for 2009 and 2017. Other data sources include the H&T index from the Center for Neighborhood Technologies. Folks may know this because it produces estimates of typical household transportation costs, but there's also estimates of household VMT in there based on census data. And then some commercial products that you might want to rely on now, like streetlight data and other big data sources, which leverage mobile devices, smartphones, and in-vehicle mobile devices to develop estimates of VMT at the household level or activity center level. Once we know where VMT is coming from, we can then start to look at where VMT is headed. In this case, we just plotted out VMT growth in proportion to population growth. This may or may not be where we're headed. If anyone's familiar with some research around autonomous vehicles, that could push VMT up even more than the trend we've seen recently. Obviously, fuel prices and energy prices also affect VMT, but growth proportion of population was our best guess here. And then we break that down by where we expect that VMT to come from. So you can see here that even looking 30 years out, compact central areas probably will not account for a very large chunk of total VMT. And as I said, that's largely because of folks in those areas driving considerably less, around 15,000 miles per year for an average household. The next largest chunk would likely come from medium density suburbs, where folks are driving about 20,000 miles per year. And the largest chunk comes from suburban fringe and rural areas, those more outlying areas where people tend to drive around 25,000 miles per year. And then that leaves one last chunk due to commercial travel. So that's freight movement, deliveries, and other sort of work-related travel. So doing this lets us get a first glimpse at where we might want to take a bite of the apple, where there might be opportunities to lower VMT in different contexts through different types of policies. With that knowledge, we can then go into imagining future policy scenarios. So what you see here is total VMT by type in 2009, in 2017, and then in 2050. So this is the same data you just saw on the last slide. But then what we can start to do is lay out some different policy scenarios. So what this means is thinking about the types of policies that apply in central urban areas, policies that apply in suburban areas, and so on, and laying them across households in each of those places. What this also does is let an agency like a DOT understand where their leverage points are. So obviously certain policies related to highways and other state roads, a DOT is going to have a lot of control over. And then there's going to be other important policies like local land use regulations that aren't going to be as much within a DOT's control. I'll just add that for this analysis, we relied heavily on the guidebook that you can see here, which came out of California. Folks may know this from a group called CAPCOA, which is the California Air Pollution Control Officers Association. Now, this resource is not really intended for scenario planning like we've used it here, but it is probably the most robust compendium of knowledge around the effectiveness of different strategies in reducing VMT. So for example, it will tell us that if you provide robust, reliable transit to a household in an urban area, then you might reduce their average VMT by up to 10%. And so on for different policies and in different place types. Then what we can do is actually think about these policy levers in the same way that you might think about energy policies or building efficiency policies and ask, what % of households do we believe we can touch with that policy? So for example, in one scenario, we say we might be able to provide robust transit to 50% of urban households. And in another, we might say we can provide it to 100% of urban households and 50% of suburban households. And then we can start to layer on the policies that way. So what are some of those strategies? I think probably most folks know what low VMT patterns look like versus high VMT. As you can see on the right here, low VMT patterns are going to involve compact mixed-use development with multimodal travel options. And then high VMT patterns are going to be more spread out and car-oriented. Now, in terms of the policies or strategies that that move us towards one development pattern or other, I've started thinking about these in sort of 3 tiers. So the first one is multimodal investments. And this is probably the most straightforward tier of investments. This is providing better walking and biking infrastructure, providing transit. And these are things that focus on giving people options. And this is really feel-good stuff that I think most people can easily get behind implementing, and it's pretty straightforward how a transportation agency would implement policies like these. However, and while we need these investments, they're not enough necessarily to start pushing the needle. For example, we can provide people with really great transit service. That doesn't mean that we will see a large shift to transit, especially if driving to work is still less expensive and faster than that option. So that brings us to the second tier, transportation demand management. So that is TDM programs and incentives that help bring the appeal and the convenience of those other travel options more in line with driving. You know, we could do that through policies like subsidizing transit passes to make transit less expensive, or pricing parking more directly so that folks will pay the direct costs of parking like they would typically with transit. And then other kinds of programs, services and incentives, ride sharing opportunities, bike lockers, any sort of thing that helps support the use of those modes. And also in there is thinking about road capacity and pricing, and think about how the ways that we invest in highway capacity and price roads influence travel behavior, and whether the way that those are set up are in line with meeting our climate goals. Last is probably the most challenging, but also the most impactful, and that is land use and development patterns. I say that's the most challenging because, as we know, it's a very decentralized system of control where local governments have a lot of control. So this requires, on the one hand, local governments encouraging and facilitating more compact mixed-use development. On the other hand, states and counties preventing outward growth through things like land conservation and transfer versus development rights. And then this also creates an opportunity for DOTs and local governments to have a conversation about some of the feedback loops that facilitate outward growth. So for example, if local governments are encouraging suburban development on outlying farmlands, and the DOTs are simultaneously widening roads or building new roads to facilitate that growth, this creates an opportunity to think about some of those interactions and feedback and figure out how to work together. Lastly, just some additional considerations that often come up in talking with agencies about policies to manage VMT. The first big one is measuring and estimating VMT impacts. So it's one thing to say that we're going to reduce VMT by 10 or 20%. It's another thing to understand how plans, programs, and projects move the needle in one direction or another. So agencies need tools to be able to screen these things and understand their impact. One starting point is often travel demand modeling. Most states don't have a travel demand model, but many MPOs do. I will add, however, that some of the older 4-step models that I think many agencies still use are probably not good for this. They weren't designed to be able to measure VMT impacts and often explicitly cannot. However, some agencies are moving towards more advanced models that can be used to measure VMT impacts of projects and programs. The second tool is sketch planning tools. These are tools like urban footprint and vision eval that let you sort of put in future growth scenarios and estimate the VMT impacts at an aggregate level. So you can do some scenario testing and figure out how plans are going to move the needle. Lastly, there's other calculators and tools, many of which work at the project level, and a lot of these are coming from California, where that's where the focus of their state law is, measuring the impacts of new developments and transportation projects. So you can look to a lot of local governments in California for some of those tools. The second piece is communication. And this means communicating VMT reduction strategies and implications, both internally and to the public. So this means having a conversation, like I've said, about what does it look like to lower VMT? What kind of world is that? How does it affect people's daily life? And then also, what are the strategies within our control to accomplish those? And what are the real implications for the way we operate day to day? And lastly, as I've already sort of hinted at, is working across agencies and divisions. So once you start to explore what meeting VMT goals looks like and pinning down the different policy levers that there are in place, it becomes clear very quickly that no single agency can do this on their own, that it really takes coordination across a bunch of agencies and divisions within agencies. Finally, before I hand it off to Nissa, I just wanted to point out some opportunities for folks who are thinking about implementing these kinds of policies. First of all, is SSTI has a clean energy cohort for state DOTs that we're going to be kicking off pretty soon. And this is going to give folks an opportunity to work together and learn from peers over the course of about a year. And share some best practices. So if anyone at a state DOT is interested in that, let us know. And then we always have technical assistance opportunities from SSTI and our partners at Smart Growth America. So just throwing an open invitation out there to reach out to me at any time and learn more about how we can help. With that, I am going to stop sharing my screen and hand things over to Nissa.
All right, thank you. See, get my share through. All right, so thank you, Chris. And yeah, so I'm Nissa Tupper, Transportation Public Health Planner with the Sustainability and Public Health Division at the Minnesota Department of Transportation. It's a mouthful. So I'm going to share a little bit about where we've been on the journey for articulating a VMT target, where we're headed, and just share some observations along the way. So to start with, for those who aren't familiar with MnDOT, so our vision, I think, is important to ground this conversation. Our vision is a multimodal transportation system that maximizes the health of people, environment, and economy. And so when we talk about VMT, I think this really grounds us in the why. You know, transportation is shifting from a model that moves cars to one that moves people, especially through safe, convenient, and a reliable system. So I think grounding ourselves in, you know, the movement of people and connecting to those goods and services that people need. And to acknowledge this shift as well. So the originally in 1917, our agency was called the Minnesota Department of Highways with a specific purpose to locate, construct, and build highways. And this shifted about 60 years later, and now the focus is on Minnesota Department of Transportation. So again, that means multimodal. Today, you know, we're a multimodal agency. We have the 5th largest highway system in the country. And about a little over 5,000 employees. That said, we own and operate about 10% of the roadway infrastructure in Minnesota. So going back to what Chris said about partnerships and working across agencies is really critical. So I think a little bit different origin of the VMT target and the concerted effort around VMT for us is it didn't come through legislative direction. So it started for our agency after a recommendation from the Sustainable Transportation Advisory Council. So we refer to this as the STAC. The STAC is specific to MnDOT. It's a new type of what we're viewing as long-term public engagement, where we work really closely with community leaders to provide us with new ideas on how we can move faster and more equitably towards a low carbon transportation future. So there's a STAC membership. They apply for a 2-year commitment. Our commissioner appoints them, and they meet regularly throughout the year and then provide recommendations to our agency each December. And then we review those and respond with what we can or cannot support. So we provide, you know, administrative support for the group, but we don't ultimately participate in the recommendations. So in 2020, the STAC provided our agency with a recommendation to adopt a statewide goal of reducing VMT by 20% by 2050. So this goal was one of several that came from the STAC in 2020, included some other recommendations around transportation system resilience, electric vehicles, clean fuel. So again, thinking about, you know, how we need to be moving forward and several levers here when we think about reducing transportation emissions. And I think it's important to recognize some of the reasons for the VMT recommendation. Chris mentioned some of this before, but you know, it's really important that additional strategies are paired with vehicle electrification and fuel efficiency, especially when we think about the value of co-benefits, which are bulleted on the slide here, that reducing VMT can help us make more progress towards in terms of thinking about what do we want our future to look like and how do we want to advance transportation equity. So in early 2021, MnDOT agreed to support a preliminary goal of that 20% as a starting place for discussion and to finalize it after engagement as part of our statewide multimodal transportation plan update. So another acronym, SMTP. So the SMTP is currently going through an update. We expect that to be finalized hopefully this fall, and that is our agency's highest level policy plan for transportation. So we're viewing this as an integral component of that plan. So again, we shared that response of our preliminary support as a starting place in March 2021. And since then, we've been working internally and with SSTI to clarify, what does this mean for MnDOT and our state? So we organized a cross-division work group internally, worked with SSTI to get a handle on, what are the strategies and tools available for us? Like he said, where is VMT coming from? We also worked with SSTI to develop some target scenarios to understand, the influence of those different types of policy levers. What happens when MnDOT leads 100%, leads 50%, just getting some general sense of, how do we shape this path forward? So based on that work, we're including draft target and partnership language in our 2022 SMTP update. So that's in the italics below, to work with transportation users and partners to identify and advance statewide strategies for reducing VMT by 20% per capita by 2050. So the SMTP update is opening up for public comment in June. And so we'll receive public comment not only on the VMT target, but a number of other elements in that plan, and then work with partners starting this fall to finalize and move towards implementation. So I think a couple important notes on this shift in terms of, how we've evolved from the specific recommendation from the stack is one is the focus on partnerships for implementation. The target is really important for accountability and communication, but we really need to be explicit and intentional about our focus on partnerships to move this forward, because we can't do this alone. And second, we're focusing on a per capita target versus statewide. And this is to help us understand the impacts of population growth, both in metro and non-metro Minnesota, and also bring the target to and strategies to a level that's easier to grasp, if you will, for folks to understand, what does this mean for me? What does this mean for my household? And so the more we've learned from other DOTs and the research and looking into strategies and having many discussions, it's become really clear to us that the VMT target is really about measuring what's important to us. So reducing VMT really isn't the outcome here. It's a way to measure how we're doing to provide transportation options. And when we think about transportation options, we're thinking about those that are safe, they're equitable, that support healthy, livable communities. And on this slide here, there's a number of ways that we're measuring our performance towards many of these outcomes. And these have been, articulated by stakeholders and by our agency as important. And so we see VMT really fitting in this outside circle as an additional measure to provide us with more information and more accountability. So Chris mentioned communication. So that has been and continues to be a key learning for us, that framing around VMT is really important, and being really crystal clear on what it means and what it is, what it's not, for our communication, and thinking about, what's important to different stakeholder groups. So the terminology VMT reduction, that in and of itself can raise concerns from the start, because of the perception that, reduction means we're taking something away from folks. So we've shifted over time to include that language, because that's what our target is tracking, but not necessarily to lead with it, because as I previously mentioned, what this is really about is providing those safe, affordable, accessible options. And that percentage target is really a measure to provide us with accountability. So as a proposed target in our SMTP, again, it's a way to give us, feedback, understand our progress towards these goals and this vision of a safe and accessible transportation system. We do see it as an alignment with our vision. Another piece that's been really important to communicate with folks, that this is a starting point. This is a way for us to get the ball rolling, and we've built in ways, and we should be building in ways to, evaluate where we're at, make refinements, and course correct along the way. We know that there's a handful of other DOTs and local partners that we can join as leaders in this space as we think innovatively and creatively about how to shape our future through our transportation system. And it's been really important to be clear about what this is not. So it's not taking away car keys. It's not a mandate to stop driving or a way to tell people how or why they should be driving. We also need to make sure that it is and needs to be in support of economic vitality, tourism, our freight industry. So it's not to minimize the growth of our economy or those industries. Another important thing we found to include in our communication is how this fits in with what others are doing. Emphasizing that we're not alone in this journey. We have a cohort of partners and supporters to lean on and learn with. So overall, we're seeing that a 20% per capita VMT target is in alignment with overall local and national efforts. So locally in Minnesota, in particular in our urban metro area, there have been some more ambitious goals that have been established. We look at St. Paul, so St. Paul, Minneapolis in the core, Eden Prairie, St. Louis Park, suburb areas. So, I mean, the key point is here we have some partners to start working with where we have alignment. And nationally, there's also DOT peers that have established similar goals. And I should note too that the VMT targets listed here, for the most part, are focused on personal vehicle travel, so not including heavy duty freight. And that's also the intent of our target. So this is some information that SSTI helped pull together for us, which gives us a base understanding of VMT trends and drivers in Minnesota. So when we look at VMT data in our state, urban highways and arterials account for the largest share of VMT growth. And the callouts on the two boxes on the right, there's a lot to unpack in terms of the nuances of types of trips and how the length of trips. So we do know that about 10% of total VMT in our state is for trips under 5 miles, and about 20% is for trips under 10 miles. So this gives us, I think, an opportunity to think about accessibility of mode options for short trips. And when we get into, thinking about how do we increase those options, how do we work with partners to support shorter, fewer trips, but also to support more mode redundancy, if you will, so that there's that choice. It's also worth noting that VMT has increased by about 40% since 1994, while population has only increased by 23%. So we have a little bit of a mismatch there. And that's also points back to our emphasis on the per capita to understand that role of population growth. So again, in the top blue, that's the language that we're including in our SMTP for public comment. And we're showing here the table with the interim year targets, the implied total for statewide. While there are unknowns, the modeling suggests we have a path forward to make progress. There are many strategies for us to lean on. Those interim year targets, those align with some of our other targets in terms of greenhouse gas reductions. So we can look at things holistically. And those are really important when we think 30 years out to provide us with an opportunity to make sure that we're in alignment with other efforts, we're course correcting where we need to. We did have conversations about setting place type targets in terms of, do we have different kinds of different targets for rural, urban, suburban, and that I think can get really complicated quickly, especially when you think about the state transportation system and how many of our roadways and projects run through multiple community types. So instead, we're focusing on an overall per capita target with an understanding that we will have a range of strategies by place type. So what works in one community type may not work in another community type or may not be as effective. So we really need to work with partners to make sure that we're prioritizing those context sensitive implementation strategies and working with locals to understand what those are and calibrating as we need to. And again, this is really a starting point for us. So we, don't want to come in saying, this is what we need to do. This is an opportunity to get partners to the table and to work collaboratively. On that note, we do see our role in several different categories, if you will. So if we think about where do we lead, so these are for strategies where MnDOT has full control, either by policy or programs, and we can take a leadership position. So this includes things like building out our state trunk highway bicycle network, or addressing congestion on the freeway. There's also opportunities in terms of VMT reduction and increasing options for partnerships. So this includes areas where policies, plans, or programs provide influence, but we may not be the lead agency. So an area in terms of VMT reduction and increasing options could include partnerships around advancing broadband access. So how do we creatively use our right-of-way to allow for more teleworking and telehealth, or park and ride facilities? And then there's also areas where we can support as the state DOT. So these are strategies where we don't have decision-making authority or necessarily investments to contribute, but there's alignment overall on our mission and our goals that we're trying to achieve. So the big one here in this conversation is the land use planning piece. So in terms of, what does this mean on a day-to-day? This slide and the following slide have been really helpful for us as we have this conversation with partners and also internally to make this, really tangible for folks. So if we think about where we're at today, and these are very high level, we know that not everybody in rural drives. There are people who bike and walk, and there'll be updates to this. But if you look at this in general, if we have, a rural community where the emphasis is on driving because of the way the community is structured, what can we do to help reduce VMT and improve those day-to-day transportation options? That could look like providing more reliable broadband access to allow for telecommuting, telehealth, looking at those short trip options to destinations like schools and grocery stores, and making sure that the infrastructure is there to provide those multimodal options and incentives around things like carpooling. In suburban communities, providing more options for travel could be improving transit, telework, pedestrian options. And in urban communities, it could look like expanding the multimodal options even more. That can be of most benefit to denser communities. So, just in general, I think just recognizing that what this looks like in different communities is going to be different, and that's something that we need to remain focused on. One other piece is, when we think about, well, what does this mean for me? For the average Minnesota driver, knowing that, averages take out a lot of nuances, driving about 20% per capita, or 20% less, within the next 30 years would be about 45 fewer miles, or about 1 hour less per week. And we know there's no such thing as an average driver, but this gives us, I think, some perspective about the scale of what this could look like. And, when I think about my travel habits right now, I'm fully telecommuting when I go. So that's a way that I've been able to certainly reduce more than an hour. When I go back to a hybrid schedule, I'm planning to bike a bit more instead of driving, because that is less expensive for me. But there's also options here like combining trips, and those might not be the options that work for someone else, and someone might be doing more, someone else might be doing less. But in general, I think we could all get on board with 1 hour less, at least, of not being in a car. And so, yeah, those are the key points that I had to share today. And I think I will stop sharing and we can move over to questions.
Great, thanks, Nissa. I'm just going to remind folks to go ahead and drop questions in the Q&A box. The chat is disabled, but you can drop questions in Q&A. We've got a couple coming in, so we'll take a look at those in a second with Michael's help. But I wanted to start just with a question for you, Nissa, or I guess maybe an observation or whatever. But you know, with the latest IPCC report and it's clear that we do need to look out into the future and think about what targets need to be. You know, look at some of those charts like I showed in the beginning and say, what's it really going to take to avoid, you know, serious issues down the road. However, I think one of the things I came out of the experience working with you was that, you know, in some ways, the exact target isn't quite as important. You know, you see in some states set very ambitious targets years ago and made very little progress on meeting them because there wasn't action to back it up. So I think setting any target as a starting point and actually talking through what's going to get us there is really important. And then, you know, then you can adjust your target and your actions as you go, like you and I both said. I'm just wondering if you had a similar experience in sort of working through what this target could look like and working with folks in the agency.
Yeah, so I guess in terms of, so I guess, are you asking in terms of setting the target and the weight of what the number means?
Yeah, I'm wondering if you could just give a little insight into what the experience of setting that target sort of triggered within the agency.
Yeah. You know, it's been a big learning curve, I think, for us for a couple of reasons. So, you know, I mentioned that this is a bit unique because this didn't come through, you know, legislative direction. The stack is something newer for our agency. And so, you know, that interaction of, you know, how do we work with this external stakeholder group that's providing us with these really valuable recommendations, which has been extremely beneficial to have their expertise at the table. You know, internally, I think having, so I mentioned we pulled together a cross agency work group, which included heavily and intentionally a lot of folks from our operations division, from our central office to our districts. And I think that has helped really push those hard questions to the front because those are the staff that are really on the front lines, if you will, with our projects and with our stakeholders and partners. And so, you know, from the beginning, it really helped. It's been helping us along the way to ask those hard questions, get clear. You know, what does this mean for freight? What does this mean for, you know, what about electric or automated vehicles, and understanding, you know, just these different nuances and being able to communicate about them. So it's been, I think having that cross agency work group has been really beneficial, and I would highly recommend that to folks because, you know, our office can't do this alone, our agency can't do this alone, so you have to really bring everybody along in the process and make sure that we're, you know, on board with what we're doing, we're answering the tough questions, and we're communicating all in alignment as well.
Yeah, obviously there's a lot to bring into alignment, but I think the conversations that I saw you folks having was really something. Michael, do you have any questions to jump in with? Or yeah.
Sure, there's a couple of questions that we've gotten in here. One of which is, how does the public respond to VMT targets? Are there political concerns? And then contrast that maybe with how folks view policies like electrification, for example.
Yeah, I can start just a little bit from our observations. So I think the timing of this work and how it is fit in with our statewide multimodal transportation plan update has provided a benefit, because that, so our highest agency plan for transportation, we conduct a lot of public engagement and stakeholder engagement. And so we were able to fit into that process. So last fall, we fit in questions to some market research that the team was doing. We attended some stakeholder forums so that we could specifically focus on VMT, because it's a big shift. It's a substantial target, and we needed some data to understand, where are folks at with this. And we did find that through both of those polling in both of those situations, the market research was representative of Minnesotans. Folks overall were supportive of a target of some sort. So that was encouraging to see. We did also ask specific questions with some focus groups in terms of, okay, so, what about these different scenarios of these different policy levers, right? So what if parking was more expensive, or what if you had more options for biking and walking? And so that's where we start to see more nuance in terms of, well, now I don't support it as that much, or maybe I do, or that's where it gets really specific to what individuals need. But overall, we have seen support for it when we've gone out and done polling like that. I think, again, key is to talk about the methods, like, what are those strategies? And the key here is that we're trying to provide more convenient, accessible, safe transportation options. So I think, that communication is key too.
Yeah, that sounds right. And I can just add what I'm seeing other places across the country is often there is a strong contingent of folks who understand the seriousness of meeting climate-related goals and pushing to see explicit VMT targets in those strategies. And at the same time, as you mentioned, talking about VMT reduction can be sort of scary, and it triggers a lot of folks to sort of wonder, like, how am I going to drive less? I don't see how that's possible, even though we're talking 30 years out. So there's a real juggling act in how to communicate to both those audiences at once. And in a lot of places across the country, I think are not having as serious a conversation about climate than others. But those folks are still figuring out how to make transportation investments and land use decisions that lead to the same kind of outcomes that we're talking about here. So often it's about finding the right strategies to achieve the right outcomes, and maybe setting targets isn't the right path for everyone.
We maybe have time for one more quick question. And of course, we've saved the biggest question for last. Could you, either of you, talk about the role of induced demand or induced traffic in meeting VMT goals, and what states can do about that issue?
Yeah, I can start. So induced demand is, by building new road capacity, we understand that is going to encourage more driving. When you open up road capacity, people take more trips, drive when they wouldn't have. And so what we see is, like, adding new road capacity, the research says within 5 or 10 years, a 1% increase in road capacity will probably lead to like up to a 1% increase in driving. So that's something to wrestle with as an agency that's building road capacity as one of their main functions. You're seeing in states like California and Colorado really starting to look at the role that the DOT plays in encouraging travel. I mentioned having real conversations about how a DOT is facilitating outward growth and how it can work with partners to sort of rein that in and come up with more collaborative strategies. And so folks are looking at tools for measuring induced demand and wrestling with that. I will say we looked at this in Minnesota a little bit, and I think I ran some numbers that, road capacity is only growing slightly faster than population in Minnesota. So looking out 30 years, there might be like an extra 10% travel that you could link to road capacity. And not all of that is the DOT. So induced demand is one important small chunk of the strategies looking outward. Nissa, did you have anything to add?
I think you covered it well. That's one of you mentioned tools. So that's our next phase, is looking at different tools, and induced demand is part of that equation. So definitely part of what we're doing.
And with that, thanks to both of our panelists today, Chris McCahill and Nissa Tupper. And thank you for joining us here on the webinar. Well, watch for future webinars from SSTI and visit ssti.us to sign up for our newsletter. And if you have further questions that we didn't get to today, feel free to reach out directly to Chris McCahill at ssti.us. And so long for now.